All right, welcome back to the second half of the discussion about America in World War II. This is part B, where we're going to look at kind of what happened from about 1943 on to the end of the war. And really, in this time, we'll see a massive change from what looked pretty bleak at the first part of World War II, if you were an American, because the Germans were moving with very little end in sight, and so were the Japanese, to ultimately our winning the war for the Western powers and trying to create a post-war world. So this will really kind of tie all that together, and we'll start off by taking a look and see what happened that allowed us to kind of turn the tide or change things against Germany. Well, if you remember, Germany had pretty much controlled all of continental Europe, with the very little exception of the island of Britain, which was a holdout, and became our major base, the U.S.'s major base in Europe. So we would put troops onto England, we would train them to the eventual landing that was going to have to happen in Western Europe to allow to push the Nazis back. We'd also had some pretty significant wins in North Africa. We'd pushed the Germans out of North Africa, and we're working our way up the Italian peninsula. So there was some positive things happening related to winning the war in the Atlantic. One of the things that was certainly helping was, given the fact that we had bases in England, we could fly our bombers over Germany and bomb their industrial production, so their factories and places where they would build munitions were something that we could take care of and knock out, whereas our factories were protected by the entire Atlantic Ocean. So while the Americans were able to crank out lots and lots of material over the course of the war, the Germans' ability to do that was minimized by our bombing. So that was a huge benefit for the Americans in the West. And also, as I said, training continued in England for our troops, and ultimately what they did was they landed on French soil in something called the D-Day invasion. If you've ever seen Band of Brothers or any other World War II movies, this is one of the most famous battles, single battles in military history. It happened in June of 1944, and it was the largest single action ever undertaken in warfare by human beings. 7,000 ships were used by the Allies to get troops to France. 23,000 paratroopers were landed behind enemy lines to kind of help pave the way for over 100,000 soldiers that hit the beaches in Normandy on the northwest coast of France. And so this was a massive undertaking, and it worked. We were able to actually hold the beaches and then start driving inland and pushing the Germans back. And that was really the beginning of the end, although there still was a lot of war to be fought at that point. As soon as we landed on Europe, continental Europe and France, and were able to kind of hold the beach, then the Germans didn't really have much of a chance. We pretty much, from that point, it was just a matter of time. Likewise, we kind of turned the tide in the Pacific against the Japanese, and certainly one of the movies that's coming out right now on HBO, The Pacific, talks a little bit about this. This was really looked at as the second front, where most of the energy and resources was being poured into the battle against the Germans. Those folks that were fighting in the Pacific, namely the Marines and the Navy, kind of got second best. So it was a really tough battle to fight. Not only were they fighting a very determined enemy, but they also had the second best stuff to work with. And really it became a battle of who was going to get there first. The Navy and the Army were working together, whereas the Marines and the Army would try to take over these little islands, and the Navy would ferry them from island to island. So it was really all of the forces coming together to try to take over the lands that the Japanese had earlier taken in World War II. It happened by something called island hopping, where the battles would take place on these little small islands. Some of them were kind of deserty islands, others were very lush and tropical, where the Japanese had a base. Americans would land on the base, usually with the Marines and the Army, would fight the Japanese, and then they do it all over again on the next island as they were kind of working their way up from Australia north towards the Japanese home islands. And there were some classic battles, one called Guadalcanal, another called Tarawa, where hundreds and hundreds of Japanese and Marines would just square off in pretty brutal jungle fighting. Ultimately, we took over the Philippines again, and the Philippines then gave us a base by which we could use to fly air raids against Japan. And so our bombers could take off from the Philippines and other islands and drop bombs on Tokyo and some of the other major industrial cities of Japan, doing what we had done in Germany, and that is knock out their ability to wage war. Towards the end of World War II, of course, the Japanese were running out of material. They weren't able to construct bombs and things of that sort, and so they took warfare to a whole nother level, where their pilots would essentially climb into a plane and use the plane as kind of a flying bomb to try to run into American ships, and they called those kamikaze raids. And of course that would kill the pilot, but if they were able to hit the ship, oftentimes they could either destroy or certainly render useless the ship itself. So it was a pretty brutal way of using your military power in the Pacific. Well, as I said, we kind of pushed the Germans back after we took the beachhead in Normandy on D-Day, and there were a couple other rather significant battles, one called the Battle of the Bulge, that still took place, that still needed to be fought. The Germans certainly weren't done by a long shot, but ultimately we were pushing east towards Germany. At the same time, the Soviets on the other front, the Eastern Front, had been pushing towards Germany, moving west, and so the Germans were caught in this kind of ever tightening circle. Ultimately, the Soviets took over Berlin. As they were on the outskirts of Berlin, Adolf Hitler, in his bunker, committed suicide, and then very soon thereafter, the Allies, both the Russians heading west and the Americans and British heading east, met up on the Elbe River in Germany, and that led to victory in Europe, or VE Day, on May the 7th of 1945, and at that point the fighting was over in Europe. It wasn't over yet in the Pacific, however, and so we had a couple of major battles that still happened there. One was the Battle of Iwo Jima, and Iwo Jima is the place where the famous picture was taken of the Marines hoisting the flag on the top of Mount Suribachi, and essentially this gave a lot of people, not only at the front but also back home, the idea that we could actually win this war against Japan. We started doing something called firebombing Japan as well, so we would use napalm, which is a jellied gasoline, drop it on Japanese cities. It would cause fires, given the fact that most of the Japanese structures were made of wood. These fires would spread and lead to huge amounts of destruction. And there's a lot of people that question whether or not this was an ethical wage warfare, because it ultimately killed over 800,000 Japanese civilians. The last major battle of World War II in the Pacific was the Battle of Okinawa, a particularly brutal battle that was going to be the major jumping stage from where the Americans were going to have to start taking over the Japanese major home islands. But the development of the atomic bomb in 1945 by American scientists essentially ended that, because the Americans then dropped two bombs, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki, two industrial cities in Japan, showing the ultimate power of the Americans. The Japanese realized that it was no longer worthwhile to wage war, and Victory in Japan Day was August 15th of 1945, and that officially ended World War II in both the Pacific and